like to start with you, Mr. Huntsman. Dr. Woodruff appropriately pointed out that if we move too quickly with reviews, that's not good. And yet, you and I both know that during the last administration, the EPA met their statutory responsibility exactly 0% of the time for chemical approvals. And so I'm curious from your perspective, if we had a better process, if we had a process that yielded the right result, how do you feel like that could better impact public health, innovation, and at the same time rein in our bad actors?
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate the comments made by both of the witnesses that are before us here today. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of disagreement here. We do need to have a well-regulated environment, and the vast majority of new chemistry development is developing to replace past formulations and past applications to make things lighter and stronger. The reason why Boeing is able to make planes that can fly nearly halfway around the world nonstop is because they're lighter, they're more fuel efficient, they're safer, they're better built, lower maintenance than they were just 15 or 20 years ago. This is all about innovation and about speed. And as we see this around the world, I don't mean to pick on Boeing, I think they're a great company, but I imagine one of their biggest competition the next generation is going to be COMAC, the Chinese manufacturer. Now, we do not need to be cutting corners to become like the Chinese in this area, but we do need to be aware that we need to be able to compete on a playing field where we can create the chemistry, we can go through the regulatory process and make sure that it is thorough in order to compete on a global basis. The United States has the highest standards in chemical manufacturing and on chemical approval. We need to keep this, and we need to keep innovating with that. As we do that, we'll continue to provide the jobs and the economic well-being and the environmental stewardship that we all want.
Excellent. Along those lines, you do business internationally, so you're familiar with the regulations in Europe. What do you think, what missteps has Europe taken that might stifle innovation here in the United States if we're not careful?
Well, I think about 70%, 65% of our sales are international. So we meet not only U.S. standards, but we meet standards all over the world. A lot of this has to do with what I'm seeing more and more, particularly in Europe, more so than in the U.S., is a lot of these environmental standards are politically driven. They're not science driven. You'll see particular countries that will retaliate against a particular company or against a particular application, seemingly purely for political purposes because a facility was to shut down or vacate that country. So I think the worst of all worlds is when we start to see politics interfere with sound science.
I'm going to paraphrase your words, and you tell me if I'm wrong. As far as a U.S. regulatory environment that makes sure that you're protecting public health and not cutting corners, you're okay with bring it on, but can it be a little bit more predictable and produce an outcome quicker? Is that a fair?
I think that's very fair.
Thank you. Dr. Gross, thank you for being with us. Could you share how those transitions well, let me go back. You've had a front row seat to the shifting regulatory landscape through your work both at the EPA and FAA across multiple administrations. Could you share how those transitions impacted your work at Boeing, particularly in relation to chemical approvals?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Boeing uses a standardized development process with internal milestones, very similar to what NASA uses in terms of technology readiness levels. That duration of development that we have very often spans multiple administrations, multiple regulatory changes. In each of those steps that we go through that gated process, we take an assessment of the current regulatory landscape. And so whatever it happens to be as that matures, we have to address it at the time. And so the challenge that a company like Boeing has, where we have these very long development timelines, is that at the beginning of a project and at the middle of the project, we may see those changes come up from the regulatory environment, from the changes in administration. It's not something I can give an example of particularly for a current issue, but it is something that we account for and deal with in our day-to-day operations.
How did the approach to reviewing new chemicals evolve over time? And what lessons should we draw from those shifts to create a more durable, consistent regulatory framework?
Thank you for the question, Senator. part of the challenge, like I mentioned in my testimony, for companies like Boeing, is that we don't hold the responsibility for the application for a new chemical or for the extended use. We rely on our supply base. And so it almost becomes this game of telephone. And so sometimes the visibility of where a chemical is in the process, or if there's a bottleneck or a hang-up, it's not always visible to us in our own development cycle. And so that mismatch between what's going on from a regulatory standpoint and our development cycle is where we end up making those hard decisions about not to move forward, say, with a new innovative chemical. And so that's where that increased visibility or increased